The Bleacher Report app is your destination for sports. Right now, the NBA's heating up, March Madness is here, and MLB is almost back. Every day there's a new headline, a new highlight, a new moment you've got to see for yourself. That's why I stay locked in with the Bleacher Report app. For me, it's about staying connected to my sports. I can follow the teams I care about, get real-time scores, breaking news, and highlights all in one place. Download the Bleacher Report app today so you never miss a moment.
The primary purpose of Uniquely Human, the podcast, is to educate and inform. The views expressed during all episodes are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute educational or medical advice. Listeners should consult with professionals familiar with each individual or family for specific guidance.
Uniquely Human, the podcast, is produced by Elevated Studio. Music is graciously provided by Matt Savage of Savage Records.
Hi, I'm Dr. Barry Prezant, clinical scholar, researcher, and consultant on autism and neurodiversity, and a Brooklyn boy raised in the big city.
And I'm Dave. I'm none of those things, and I grew up on a farm in Illinois. But being on the spectrum myself, I have plenty of personal insight to lend.
And this is Uniquely Human, the podcast, a show that illuminates and celebrates autism and neurodiversity. So today we are so excited, and personally I'm thrilled to have Dr. Jamie Herricks with us to discuss so many issues that will be enlightening for so many of our listeners. Jamie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, no, thank you. It's my pleasure.
A little bit about Jamie, and we'll move ahead. Jamie is an autistic ADHD Gestalt language processor, a special education teacher, a literacy specialist, and an author whose work bridges lived experience with professional practice. She has authored 3 major books for Lived Places Publishing. One's called No Place for Autism, published in 2023, Holistic Language Instruction, published in 2024, and Decolonizing Language Education, published in 2025. Alongside more than 1,000 articles on autism, language, and education. Jamie is a credentialed special educator with 3 master's degrees and a PhD, and she integrates classroom practice, systemic analysis, and narrative craft to reimagine literacy for Gestalt language processors. Her research and teaching challenge deficit-based framings of autism, and she advocates for meaning-based, accessible, and affirming approaches to learning. Beyond the classroom, she is widely recognized for her critical writing on the intersections of neurodivergence, gender, and society, and for her commitment to reframing autistic communication as a site of strength, creativity, and knowledge. So we always love, Jamie, to begin by having our guests to share some important aspects of your personal and professional journey and how you became involved in your current work. And just to let our listeners know, if you listen or read Jamie's Substack, you can get a lot more specific information. But give us an overview, Jamie.
Sure. I am actually in Act 4 of my life. Act 3, for me, I was a forensic scientist by profession, and I'm retired. I'm a pensioner now as a teacher. I had a small private practice after I retired. And unfortunately, with COVID and everything that happened around that, I was consulting on cases at the national level for our federal government. And with COVID, I lost my business. And I thought to myself at the time, I have all these degrees and whatnot. And I had created a complete curriculum for the forensics, digital and multimedia forensics, because when I started, there was none. And so I got involved with the Obama administration to standardize forensic science and all of these types of things. Me, autistic, semi-literate, but whole to part, seeing the whole picture and then going to part and so on. And I was first generation in digital forensics, and there were a handful of us doing this, and doing science kind of in a Gestalt and autistic way. And I ran into a lot of autistic people undiagnosed. At the time, I was undiagnosed. And I'm seeing these patterns. And then the Wizards of Smart said that, well, you should have at least a bachelor's degree in your discipline to do the work, and you should have a master's degree in your discipline to supervise the work. And of course, you would need a doctorate in your discipline to offer expert testimony. And at the time, I had enough credits for maybe 2 years of college because, of course, I'm illiterate. I was not literate, comprehensive. I was functionally illiterate when I began in forensic science. And so the panic begins. And I start this kind of very long journey on what that means, and eventually come into literacy, eventually work out what that curriculum might look like, author it, and then realize that in America, in order to run a school of instruction, you have to have a PhD in education. You have to have had a master's degree in instructional design to design the work. So I have that. I have some business degree stuff, my bachelor's in business. So I had all of that when COVID happened. And the whole American judicial system was recreated by the administration. And I was out of a job. My business was defunct. And there I am with family and whatnot, thinking to myself, well, what do you do with a PhD in education and all of this, educational background and stuff, and with the judicial system that has basically decided it doesn't want to go to court, what do you need an expert for? And I was sitting kind of, submitting resumes and all of this kind of stuff. I was not thinking of teaching. I was not thinking of literacy. I was not thinking anything other than the fact that, and I didn't have the language for this, that I'm a Gestalt processor and that I'm autistic, is hamstringing me in getting employment. And then panic is setting in. And I was on LinkedIn and I saw an advert for AmeriCorps and their Teach for America program. And I thought to myself, well, they'll never take me. I'm a geezer. I'm so old. and you kind of start a teaching career at my age. But I thought, I have no other prospects, really. And time is running out and my savings are running out and all this kind of stuff. So I applied. And to my eternal shock, every step of the way, they accepted it. Like, I cannot do any relocation. I have to stay in the Los Angeles area because that's where I am. And, no, it's fine. It's like, well, I can teach any number of things. And they thought, well, you're being autistic and whatnot. It would be very good for you. I could have taught, high-level mathematics. I could have taught English or whatever. But they thought, with your lived experience, being a special ed, education specialist, credentialed teacher, would be a perfect fit. And it just so happens that there's a ton of need for that right now. So they accepted me, and they basically held my hand all the way through the initial credentialing process, and I went to Loyola Marymount to do my internship and all of that kind of stuff. And they found me a job in Los Angeles Unified, and this is all during COVID, during pandemic, and we're all on Zoom, and there's no connection, and I'm feeling very disoriented because I love that attunement that we have as autistic Gestalt processors. And I'm feeling very kind of untethered. But then the pandemic subsides a bit and the district is very anxious for us to go back into classroom. And we did. And then I met my students for the first time and I felt the frequency of the classroom and the buzz. And I had a segregated setting, a special day program class of what they call mild to moderate, but they were, IEPs. Every student had an IEP. Some had it for emotional disturbance. Some had it for specific learning disability. Some were autistic. Some others had the OHI for behaviors, the other health impairments, and so on. But what I was noticing as I sat with them the first few days is myself. Struggles with language, struggles with regulation. And I remember a thing that I said to the person who eventually hired me is that I don't do classroom management. I don't do behavior plans. I don't do token economies. I don't do any of that. I form a relationship with the children. I listen to them. We speak together. We build an ecology in the classroom that is supportive, right? And I kind of do it myself as an autistic person with all of the sensory sensitivities and so on that I have, that I have to create a place where I can exist. And in doing so, it turns out that they can exist as well. And that class before I got there, the principal called it Fight Club because they were so emotionally charged. And every day there was a fight, maybe two, emotional outburst to absolutely throttling somebody. And so I thought, well, what am I getting myself into, right? At the end of the year, the principal approached me and thanked me because we went from, 1, 2, 3 fights a day in that class the year prior to my coming there to 3 fights maybe a week. And I thought that was massive improvement. They had no idea what I'd done, right? When they do the observations, because I'm a brand new teacher, right? When they would do the observations, they would come in and look, they didn't recognize anything, right? Nothing that they had been taught to do and to say in classroom was present in my classroom. And yet scores had improved, and yet behavior had stabilized. Children were regulated. When they went into the other classrooms for their art time, etc., they were calm, they were regulated, they felt comfortable because they had not been overstressed about things. And we had relationship, and I had relationship with parents, and I would walk the children out to the out of the classroom at the end of the day, and greet the parents, and I think that was just me being me. There was no gimmick, there was no plan. It was just, this is where I want to be, this is how I'm going to be, and no apologies.
If I could just add, we recently had some guests, and I'm part of this team, on what's called developmental relationship-based intervention approaches. And you are describing exactly what we hope can be, I hate to say it, but it needs to be done, to be formalized so other people can say, this is the approach we take. Whereas for you, it was part of your DNA to do that.
Well, I think I makes sense. I kind of believe they're trying to standardize it or something. I learned from my grandmother, at her kitchen table in her garden, how to talk to people, how to grow things, how to bake, and all of these kinds of, kind of relational things. And I just look at that upbringing, 1970s, just listening to my gran, just sitting with her and watching BBC or whatever, not trying to do my own thing, and all of my scripts come from that, right? Not just the language scripts, but how to talk to people, how to sit with people.
Yes.
Scottish culture, I think, is that way as well, where, we have Kaylee, we have, all of these different types of things that involve getting together with friends.
Yes.
And chit-chatting, and as an adult, whiskey, conversation lubrication and that kind of stuff, but you cannot help anybody if you don't know them, right?
Yes.
You cannot ask them to do something if they're not known to you, and I think these are just fundamental to humanity. They're not necessarily Gaelic or whatnot, but I think I had the privilege of age when I became a teacher to say, no, I'm not doing all that bollocks. I'm not I'm just going to do what I know how to do. I in my life as a forensic scientist, I trained the first and second generation of practitioners around the world. And I did it in relationship, right? I was never a copper. I was never a police officer or anything like that. And I'm in the room with all of these armed and aggressive people or whatnot. I had to have some kind of relationship with them. And I'm obviously different than them culturally and everything, every sense of the word. But I had to form a relationship, and I think that's important.
Yeah, and I just loved the way you just put it. You can't help anybody unless you know them, and that's so crucial, especially with what's going on with discussions around Gestalt language processing. That many of the people who have been critical don't know Gestalt language processors. So if you could help our listeners kind of understand what you mean when you say you are a Gestalt processor. I think some of our listeners, and many probably have some general notion, but once again, your critical point that it's not just about language. It's not just about scripting about your experience or being echolalic. It's about how it's the lens through which you experience all aspects of your life.
Why? Well, I think I'll start a step back because, again, Gestalt processing is whole to part, right? And so you asked me to come on, and I said, sure, I think that'd be grand. And then I asked you for the questions.
Yes.
And you were gracious and you sent those to me. That's the way I, as a Gestalt processor, professionally prepare for things, because I cannot really mitigate on the fly as well if I don't know what's coming. And so I think about it in terms of how I prepare to speak, right? an analytic processor would have flashcards and they would have little bullet points on zingers and all of these kinds of things, right? That's not how I prepare as a Gestalt processor. I don't generate discrete answers on demand. And I did this in my professional practice as a scientist as well. For me, it's not extraction, right? It's not improv in that way. It's organization over time. And as I get older, I get better at it. I let your questions into my mind, all 7 of them, and I live with them for a bit, a few days. What are the patterns here? How am I feeling about this? What is the sensory experience of this? What about theories and my own experience? And then a coherence forms. And I say to myself, well, this is 7 questions or whatever, but I think it's really 3 themes here. And so let me start organizing this, and then I write. And for me, there is I kind of separate autism and ADHD and Gestalt. They're not discrete units. So I don't start writing right away. When I received your things, I read them. I just let it sit. I can tell when something is ready to come out. I have a panic attack. I start to feel anxious. I start to feel like I'm going to explode, and then I must get to a keyboard. I must start typing. I don't have the dexterity like that we put kids in occupational therapy now for grip issues, and so I don't have that. So I type. I love technology for that standpoint. But writing and organizing and all of that stuff is how coherence happens for me. And so the stuff that you find on the outside on Substack, these are whole gestalts. And sometimes they become a series because Substack has a word limit, right? So I cannot write a book or a dissertation. It becomes, like 7 articles or whatever. But this is how I access what I know. Right. And then you say, well, how did I come to know this? How did I come to know that I was a Gestalt processor? Right. And unfortunately, you have to step outside of America to do this. In America, the science that we think we know and that we rely upon and that is objective is not any of that. It was imported, actually it was re-imported after World War II. And it's absolutely interwoven with eugenics, right? And the science of human improvement, as they say, and what is the ultimate human. And of course, we know the history of that. And the ultimate human is, tall, blonde, and handsome, right? And I'm tall, but I'm not blonde and certainly not handsome. But anyways, if you take a step outside of that and you say, well, it wasn't Leo Kanner and it wasn't Hans Asperger who did the original work on autism. It was a wonderful little Ukrainian Jew working in Moscow almost 15 years earlier. What did she do? What did Sukhareva do with autistic people, right? She didn't study. She didn't try to correct. She studied them, boys and girls, in relation, right? And she's absolutely loved in Moscow. She has a hospital named after her, right? And the people, absolutely, her legacy is amazing. But then you think about relationships whole to part, right? What was going on at that time in the Soviet Union? Well, if you're American, you're not allowed to ask that question, obviously, because Soviet Union, bad, Cold War, all that stuff. But I'm Scottish and my family is Marxist. So I have access to that information. And I say to myself, what was she on about and who were her colleagues? Well, her colleagues were Vygotsky, Luria, Leontiev, right? And this whole kind of legacy of what the Soviets did with Gestalt theory, right? And they had just come out of revolution. They had just come out of war, devastating 2 wars. They lost, 30 million people. They had a peasantry that they had to make literate. Now, because they wanted to industrialize, because the Americans had closed them off from the world's markets. And so how did these people do it? That was my question. How did they, in one generation, take an illiterate peasantry and go to Sputnik? Right? How did they do that? And I don't want to say, Soviet bad, Russia bad, whatever. I just want to know what they did. And I found out that what we got of Vygotsky, the ZPD and all that stuff, there's a whole world behind that, Leontiev, etc., on the psychology side. And I just went with it, right? I just put all of that into my head and I said, that makes sense. It's coherent, right? So your original question, how do I know I'm a Gestalt processor? Well, I have to say I'm self-identified because there's no test, right? How do I know I'm human? Right? You can look at DNA and all of these kinds of things. How do I know my heritage, my ancestry, all of this kind of stuff? I just am, right? And so, yes, I have an autism diagnosis. Yes, it says I have level 2 support needs and language, and this is how they materialize at my age and in my profession. But I think in all, you have to believe someone when they say what they are. And you can do that fairly easily if you're in relationship with them and if you know them. And everything in their life is coherent. Everything matches up. I am who I am in my house. I am who I am in my profession. I was who I was as a forensic scientist. Before that, as a professional athlete, etc. Right? I've always been Jamie. I've always been this kind of goofy person who sees these things this way.
Yes. It's interesting because so much of my early training in psycholinguistics, we read Vygotsky. We read Luria, we read Piaget, and it came from primarily non-American models of child and human development, which I was on the tail end of it being dominated by American behaviorism, and Skinner, which still, has an incredible residual effect right now. But I think the one thing that you do so beautifully and is so important in learning from lived experience is observing with humility. It is really letting the patterns come at you when you are spending time and sharing happy times and sharing dysregulated times with other people. And it's not about, is that appropriate or inappropriate according to some kind of arbitrary standards that some people have set that they think is the rules that we have to behave by. So obviously this really spills over into the way you support your students. And I think you've already described beautifully, the whole relationship-based piece and the developing trust piece as being essential.
Yeah, this makes me think of a lot of the parents that I support who are coming to me, like when you were talking about that, Jamie, saying, I don't use these token boards. I don't do this. I don't do that. I just came into it and I observed and I did what I felt was right. I did these are the types of environments that parents are coming to me and trying to have fostered in classrooms. And these institutions are coming back and saying, even though you might see that works at home, that reality doesn't exist. Or, this can't possibly happen in these systems because those things like those token boards and compliance-based things are so deeply ingrained. And whether that discomfort's or that pushback's coming from discomfort or not knowing, they're not listening to these parents that are coming to them and saying, this is my reality. These things don't work for my child. We need to change these systems. And they're getting pushback saying no, your reality isn't possible. It's not something we can possibly do in these systems. So I just wanted to point that out because listening to you say, you were in this classroom that went from, as you said, Fight Club to such a huge drastic change. These things can exist. These things can work if we listen to people's reality.
And I know in that first year in the classroom, I had a student hyperlexic. Right before we had the word, before in my mind I had the word for hyperlexic. This was hyperlexia, and the boy had amazing prosody. He sounded like he could present the news, right? And it was just perfect, pitch perfect, pace perfect. He went through it timing wise, all of the Dibble scores and all of these kinds of things. He was off the chart, right? And the school system would stop there and say, well, the young man is proficient. And so I did what I know to do. I asked him, so what does that mean to you? He had no idea. He had no comprehension, right? So he had learned the patterns. He had learned the sounds. He had learned all of that stuff. But like me, when I was his age, I had no idea what he read. And I keep coming across these students who have these scripts, and they know, because they're very smart, what it is that they have to say to get what they need. I must go to the restroom. Can I go blow my nose? Can I go drink water? Right? And then whenever they're confronted, sorry, mister, sorry, miss. Right?
Yeah,
and that's their repertoire right there. Right? And so when I sit down with them and I start talking to them and I realize that they don't have words, right? Whether or not they're on my caseload and I manage their IEP, I'm in their classrooms, right? I'm trying to teach you geometry. I'm trying to teach you analytic trigonometry, whatever. I don't want to hear scripts. I want to, this rehearsal of, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, whatever. I want to know what you know. I want to know how that makes you feel. I want to know what it means to you. And when I realize that they're kind of stumbling, I'm like, okay, let's slow down a bit. Right. Talk to me about your favorite thing. And so I can see where their development is linguistically and socially, and how they've been isolated and these kinds of things. And it's, as an autistic person, as a Gestalt processor, that attunement is necessary, I think. I can feel the energy shift. I can feel the tension in the room. I can feel when it's getting out of hand, and I know, and I can kind of ride with it, right? And it's not just a professional thing. I do that in my own personal life, etc. And it's not a bad thing. Sometimes it could be quite a good thing. But in that sense, right, you talked earlier about facilitated communication and non-speakers. And because of our position where we are in Los Angeles, we receive a lot of newcomers. And they're coming from war, and they're coming from absolute poverty and desperation. And a lot of like the psychology of selective mutism, where they just shut down for whatever reason. And most of these students, they score very poorly on standardized tests. But when I sit with them and I realize they're quite bright and they know quite a lot, they're just in a panic. And more so now with all of the immigration mess that we have in our country here. But in my classroom, I can do what I want, right? I have full control. And so we'll sit down. And I asked myself, there was a boy that I met, he's since graduated, but when I met him in the 9th grade, he had only been here a few years from Guatemala. But he seemed very, very bright, but he didn't say very much at all. And his scores were dismal. And I thought to myself, what would it take if I honored his IEP and all of his supports with complete fidelity in doing the standardized test that we must do to every student? Well, it took an extra 2.5 hours to, in the moment, give him the scaffolds, right? To read the question with him, to give him the scaffolds. Right then, this is what you do. He tested at grade level. And so that you would say is facilitated communication scaffolding, right? So I was very excited. I'm like, oh, this is great. I went to my superiors and I said, this is what I've done. This student has performed amazingly. He's quite bright. He's a wonderful kid. I talked to his mother and I was reprimanded. Because according to the provider of the test, these are the only accommodations that are allowed. And I said, well, bollocks to that, because the national law governs IEPs, and so I'm going to do that. And I have a PhD and you don't. But that's the type of thing I'm talking about relationship-wise. I can tease that out. I can feel where they're struggling and I can adapt in the moment. Can you document that? Can you write about how I practice teaching as a Gestalt processor who happens to be autistic and alexithymic and all of this stuff? No, you cannot, but that's not the point. That's not the point.
You're emphasizing an issue that's come up in our previous discussions on the podcast, and that is, this abstract notion of independence being the promised land, where all quality of life is far more dependent upon interdependence, on how we support each other, how we respect each other, and another term that's become almost cliche-ish but still is such an important issue, and that is assuming competence. You assume that this person is capable of learning with the right supports. And I know many people, unfortunately, especially in autism, say, no, that kid has to prove what he knows. He has to throw out those behaviors that we can chart to tell us what he knows, where the knowing comes through the relationship.
Well, I see this in personal life too. My family is from the West Highlands of Scotland. There are kind of 6 regions, dialects, etc. And the West Highlands are the least populated. Gaelic people survived because of community, because of matristic values, because of sharing, because of all of these types of things. We know what we know, you know. And I've written a few pieces about the stone-born people, is how kind of I refer to them, to differentiate between the scholars and myself telling stories. But you cannot build a machine out of stone that lasts 6,000 years and is accurate to this day in charting stars and sun and moon if you don't have community and relationship, because some of those functions take 40 years to develop. And how do you do that across generations, right? And so the island people, the West Highlands, are distinct in that way, because it takes that time to develop. It takes that relationship to maintain it over generations. The individualist says, you know, you must fragment yourself. You must go off and do your own thing and make your own accomplishments. And the communitarian says, well, who am I if I have not lifted up my family, if I've not lifted up my community? And that communitarian aspect is kind of what I grew up in. My grandmother's garden and her sharing and all this kind of stuff, stories. And I bring that into the classroom. I bring that into my writings, you know. So I do kind of flavor some of the stuff on Substack with that aspect of it. And then I think, you know, as I've written myself into coherence, I guess, really connected with the poetic aspect of Scottish life. And I've really enjoyed writing poetry, which if you would have met me as a 20-year-old, there's no possible way I could have done that, right? But just to kind of challenge the notion, that analytic notion that at 18, we become fully functional adults and we go off into life and we build our own house and we get our own career and all this stuff. I didn't write really my first poem until after 50, right? I didn't get my PhD into my late 40s, right? I've written 10 books in total, and across my whole life, probably 5,000 articles and journal papers, like this kind of stuff. But I didn't start that right away. It took me time to develop, especially against what the dominant thing was, right? That it must be done this way. You must write this way, you know, claim, evidence, reason, etc. And sometimes my writing kind of makes fun of that. Right? It kind of illustrates the absurdity of it by being absurd within it. And I have fun with these things. But for me, you know, I don't offer PhD or master's degree as a credential. Like, you must believe Jamie because doctorate. No, I know because I am, and I have been. And this again is my 4th act of life, and every transition has been a complete starting over from zero. Sometimes in a foreign country, and because I am who I am, and relationship is important and stuff, it tends to work out okay. And I tell that to parents, that I think Gestalt processors have a leg up on things because we know how to be in relationship. We know how to feel our way through things. Can I point to a credential? Can I point to a diagnosis? Right? Can you, Dr. Barry, give me a GLP diagnosis? No, of course not.
Right. You know, maybe it's a crude analogy, but going back in time, almost half a century, for my doctoral dissertation, I was working with 4 little preschool Gestalt language processors kids for a year before I really got that level of relationship and understanding how each one of them very uniquely in their own way were communicating through their units and chunks of language. And then it was the second year with them in a wonderful classroom that the teacher made it feel like family for all of us way back when. And that's when I said, okay, now this needs to be studied, and this is a great avenue for my doctoral dissertation. But it took that time to be with them. And of course, people on my committee said, well, isn't that biased? These are kids you know. You know, you're walking with preconceived notions. No, I'm walking in with spending a year in relationship with these kids who've been totally misunderstood, especially their language has been totally misunderstood. Fascinating. So I'd like to make a little bit of a right turn here. And you talk so importantly about Gestalt memory and trauma, and all of the issues related to that. And to tie it into Jess's experience with families, maybe we could have Jamie first talk about that, and then regulation and how acknowledging the special ways that Gestalt processors connect and communicate is such an important foundation of regulation for them. But go ahead, Jamie, if you might. I'm sorry for kind of setting this on the tee for you, but
well, I think, again, whole to part, I don't store memory as discrete units. Do you remember that time? It's not memory, it's the complete experience. Mm-hmm. And so you can think of it, I think you have to take a step into kind of esoteric life. I don't process the memory as memory. It is stored whole. The now is preserved, locked away. So when I step into and retrieve a memory, I get sight, smell, feel, all of the senses. Mm-hmm. Everything is real. It's now. Unfortunately, sometimes multiple nows want to come now. And they crowd things out. And this can lead to meltdown. This can lead to shutdown if it's not managed correctly. But because this is not written about as such, when it happens to children, parents don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. When I experienced my first shutdown in my 20s, there was no autism as we know it today. This was DSM-3, I think. And so when I had this shutdown, I was living in Europe, and I did not understand my system as autistic. I did not understand my system as designed. I ran it into the ground. The result was shutdown. Mm-hmm. It's now that we understand autism and all these types of things, sensory processing and alexithymia, it makes perfect sense what happened. But at the time, the doctors in Southwest Germany had no idea what was going on. And their solution was, since I was not a German national, go home. Well, because I did not know what happened, and because I had a very traumatic past, when I got to home, as it was, psychology was like, well, you had a traumatic past, and that's why. There was no autism, there was no Gestalt, there was no nothing. And so, because I was not in attunement with myself, I did not understand how myself worked, I went back to being who I was. That led to shutdown, and I had another shutdown. And then this time, this was in America. And when you're 6'7", very strong and very capable, America does what America does. It institutionalizes you. And because I did not have the words of the institution, I was in an institution for much longer than I should have been. And when it comes to my aversion for ABA and verbal behavior and stuff, it took me about 10 times longer than I should have been there to get the scripts I needed to let them know reliably that I was safe to let go. Right? So I was very much over the shutdown. I had no idea why anyways, but I was warehoused and all this kind of stuff. So when I recall, when I step back into that memory, it's still fresh. I still feel terrified. I still feel panicky. How do I get out of this lockdown as a young, 22-year-old person in a place that's foreign to me and all of this kind of experience? So Gestalt memory, trauma, all that stuff, when I start talking about it, is not 30 years ago. It's now. Right? When I recall some event, right? The first time I heard drum and bass, it's a wonderful event, right? The first time I had a Red Bull, right? It's like, oh, wow. And I feel it because I preserve now and I can step back into now. And I don't think modern psychology has any kind of framing for that. They don't believe us when we say this. And so when I speak about my children's childhood, I step into the now of that, and it's wonderful. And the day I met my wife and all of that stuff, I can exist in the now. It's fresh. And people will say, I have amazing recall. I don't. I step into the now and I describe what I'm seeing. And I can do this in my mind. And then I can teach other people how to do it slowly. But it's overwhelming at first when you start doing it. And so there are things outside of the mainstream that I have discovered that people would discount, like liminal spaces and liminal dreaming and stuff like that, to try to manage the emotional overload. And I would say, oh, that's new age poppycock or whatever. But they've helped a lot in managing that, and having safety, having security financially, and these kinds of things that come with a bit of old age. I have more access to gestalts. I have more access to things that I want to process, right? And so from that standpoint, I think we have to be very careful in guiding people that are new to going through this, that if you are a Gestalt processor, like I would say that I'm at the very extreme end of Gestalt processing, like almost pure, almost 100%, right? That when you start stepping back into these Gestalts from your past, it can re-traumatize you. It can, if you're not properly supported, if you're not ready for it, it can be just as traumatic as it was then. And I think we must understand that. And I think sometimes practitioners, they don't get this temporality. They don't get the idea that time is not quite what they think it is. The past is the past because of some elementary school science thing that they learned, but it doesn't really work that way. And for a Gestalt processor, existing in multiple nows is disorienting until you learn kind of how to do it. It doesn't make it less disorienting. It just makes it navigable, if that's the right word for it.
So, Jess, how does this impact your discussions with parents, especially, one thing I just wanted to interject is how superficial the term PTSD seems when you hear the deep dive that Jamie just went into right now, or, the kid's having a meltdown, or what's the antecedent? It's like, go ahead, Jess.
No, I mean, as you were just talking, Jamie, my mind was in so many different places. I was like, I want to touch on that. I want to touch on that. I want to touch on that. But the one thing I keep going to is when parents come to me, for the most part, because I have a private practice where I solely see Gestalt processors, they typically come to me with at least knowing Gestalt language processing. They've heard of it. They might not fully know, deep dive into it, but they've at least heard of it. And a lot of times they come to me and I say, we need to take a step back, and we need to realize that your child is a Gestalt processor in so many ways. Like you keep saying, right? It's not just language. It's their whole way of being. And when they come to that realization, so many things that they were coming to me that they were struggling with, where it might be times where their child is shut down, they start to understand why that might be. And then I think sometimes they really get stuck in trying to figure out, like, what is that root cause? What is that single cause of that happening? And something that you were saying, and I've read in your work too, and the things that you've written, is we don't always have to go back to that root cause, right? Like sometimes it's just understanding that they are a Gestalt processor in more than just language, and just attuning to them and having a caring response. And that is what I try to get them to keep going back to, because I think when we get so stuck in trying to figure out what might that cause be, right? Is it trauma? Is it this? Is it that? We get so stuck in that, we're forgetting that they just need our support in the now. And when you were saying that, it's brought me back to so many conversations with families that I've had where I'm just trying to get, trying to just educate them on, your child is experiencing everything as a Gestalt processor, not just language. And I think going back to what we were saying about their realities being denied, right? Like then them going to the schools and saying, oh my gosh, I just learned that not only are they a Gestalt language processor, they're processing everything this way. And then they're saying, well, that reality doesn't exist, right? And so then they're struggling in school and all these things. So yeah, everything you just said had me thinking of so many conversations and experiences that I've had with families.
I know my discussions with families are always off on the wrong foot. because of where I work and who I work with, and we are the poorest of the working class communities of Los Angeles, where I teach, and there's such turnover. There's such, I think people move there because it's the cheapest, and then they can't wait to get out or something. So my caseload is turning over 50% a year, right? And in the summertime, I'm anticipating, okay, how has my caseload changed? And I do a deep dive of every case file I get. And so I want to understand the why behind the student, behind the numbers and stuff. And I do everything. I start hold apart. I read everything. I sit with it, and I take my time with it. And usually it's about a month into term when I finally meet parents. And I start off very frankly and kind of just, to use a Scottish way of saying, take the piss out of the argument. Nobody in the community puts 6'7" and woman in the same sentence. So we'll start there. I am obviously very light-skinned and obviously sound very different than anyone in the community. Fine. Don't worry about that yet. Let me present what I see in the case package. And then I do what I do. I say, I found all of this information. It says this clinically. But let me tell you beyond that, the why. Let me explain to you. And I've had parents cry. Like nobody has ever described my child, right? And I say, if you trust me with the education of your child, with the development of literacy and numeracy in your child, and as their advocates on campus, I guarantee you they'll grow. I guarantee you they'll develop. And I have a new kind of case in point, but the majority of my caseload now is in the 12th grade. They're getting ready for graduation. When they were in the 10th grade, I noticed that for Algebra 2, everybody with an IEP bar 1 the year prior, right? So these children are going into Algebra 2. The cohort that was leaving, everybody with an IEP bar 1 got an F in that class. And I thought to myself, well, these are my kiddos, this is my caseload. I'm getting all mama bear on them. And I said, well, what do I need to do to make sure that doesn't happen? Because if you do not pass this class, you do not graduate. That's your third year of mathematics in high school. And so I don't want them to have to kind of shift and shuffle and figure something out. I want them to pass the class. I want them to understand the material, because Algebra 2, as I explain it, because I'm now teaching it, is the mathematics of adulthood. And so I just offered translation in the moment. Yes, these are logarithms. Yes, these are imaginary numbers. Yes, this is, exponentials and stuff. But this is also your lease payment. This is also your investments. This is also the mortgage you're going to be signing, and all of these things, how they work and how they conspire against you. And so I'm building relationship in that. And I'm happy to say every single one of my students passed.
Wow.
With good grades and with understanding and with the elevation of standardized test scores and all of that kind of stuff, because of relationship and because we could tell stories and because we could share fears. And I would tell students in the moment, yeah, this sucks. Yeah, the curriculum is crap. Absolutely. And so here's how we're going to fix it, right? And you can say, this is the self-regulation strategy development model, in academia. And it was part of a master's degree in SPED that I theoretical constructs and all that stuff. But it doesn't matter to them, right? I'm just telling them. They know I'm autistic. They know I'm a Gestalt processor. They know ADHD and lexithymia and all this kinds of stuff. And I explain in the moment, when I see this is how I'm feeling. I'm thinking, this is a trick. This is a trap. They're writing it as a certain way to take me down a certain road. They're presenting me with the most attractive wrong answer. And here's how we're going to get around it. We're going to treat it like a game.
Yeah.
And so here's how we can reverse engineer this thing. So we can use probability to say, this is probably the right answer.
And you're connecting it to lived experience. You're basically saying that this will be a part of your lived experience. And that's why it's meaningful and important.
Aye. And for me, a relationship is very important. And I guess, the way that I do things does not work outside of a relationship.
Well, one thing you do talk about is how much of your experience is more in the body, if you will, rather than in words. And when we were just talking about trauma, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Bessel van der Kolk, who's a psychiatrist who his whole career specialized in trauma. And he published a book, oh my goodness, probably a decade ago at least, that was called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's about the body keeps the score in terms of not only single incidents of trauma, but he also talks about cumulative developmental trauma, which I really believe so many young autistic and neurodivergent kids experience. The way they're dismissed, the way they're misunderstood. Sometimes it's not one incident of them being physically or sexually abused. It might be just being denied a voice, being denied the ability to express whatever they wish to express over and over and over again. But, reading your work and talking about how much, as a Gestalt processor, your experience is multimodal. It isn't a bunch of words in your head that you happen to memorize. It just struck me that I think some of the deeper thinkers in trauma now kind of talk about that trauma impacts a person's life in sense, in cognition, in social engagement, in surviving in different environments. So important to understand.
I think there's multiple aspects in that. There's so much, just like Jess said, my mind's going this way and that way. But my book, the first of the trilogy, as it were, the No Place for Autism, is not necessarily meant to be ironic. I became a special education credentialed teacher as an autistic person, as a Gestalt processor. And I went into spaces as I was onboarding into my employer, and as I was going through internship for the credential and all the classes that I must take at college and everything. And everything about autism was the assumption that it's a childhood thing. That with the right remediation, with the right, extinguishing of behaviors and so on, these little buggers, they'll be fine. Like somehow autism is something that you can be rid of, right? Like if we just manage your diet, you won't be diabetic anymore, even though you don't have pancreas or whatever, right? And it was so reductive. It was so insulting. It was so, I don't want to say traumatic, but it kind of was, because these spaces imagined that people like me would cease to exist. And it's very existential. And when you think about that in the children's life, and I've come across colleagues who have that view, that it's a childhood thing that they grow out of, right? And if they don't, well, then, there goes my being a soccer mom, and there goes my plans for grandparenthood, and all of these kinds of things. And the more I was in that, the more I wanted to correct the record. And so that's where No Place for Autism came from, really. I would like to say that it cured everything in my employer, but it didn't. Most people in my district, which is the second largest in the country, don't even know I exist, and that's fine with me. And there was a certain point I was taking part in a kind of a panel discussion conference thing, and that was reappearing again. And I thought to myself, how many times do I have to come into a professional space where they don't imagine us as adults? Right? And that's when I kind of made the decision to sit with the idea of writing about what it feels like experiencing life as a mature autistic adult. Right? And I did it, as I usually do, from lived experience. And for me, that was late 80s queer San Francisco. Right? And so that second Substack comes from that standpoint of, this is not like a prescriptive type thing. It was just me sharing, this is how alexithymia, attunement, relationship, Gestalt processing of spaces exist. In the midst of trauma. This was the AIDS crisis. This was the pandemic. Being queer is deadly, that kind of stuff. And so I write about it. This, I don't intend to write series on Substack, but they kind of turn out that way. I did a series about love, on different containers for love and different ways of experiencing it, because I have a very inquisitive family. My children, they kind of hesitate to talk to me about something because they'll get one of these kinds of lectures or whatever, right? The parent won't shut up. So I write and I put things on Instagram and these kinds of stuff because I know they're very smart and they're very inquisitive and they spy on me. And they read these things on Instagram and they read the things on Substack and stuff. And so I can have that talk with them without having that talk, right?
Yes.
And I don't write it to narrow possibility. I write it to expand things,
Yes.
right? There is more than one way to experience humanity and adult life. And so I write about it. And I
Yes.
don't find many people writing from an offensive standpoint. That yes, a mature autistic adulthood with alexithymia, with ADHD, with this Gestalt processing mind can be amazing, absolutely amazing, if you don't think you're broken.
Yes.
And if you understand how to operate your body and mind as designed,
Yes.
and how amazing the world can be sensually if you can do this safely. And so I write about it, as I always do, and I share it. And when it comes to love, what are the containers for relationship that work for Gestalt processors? How does an expansive mind fit in narrow constraints that society dictate? And so, that bleeds into gender and all sorts of other things. But I don't want to constrain, I don't want to foreclose a future that says, autistic boys must do this.
Right. Yeah.
Well, what about autistic girls? What about non-gender, non-binary? What about all of this, this wonderful expression of humanity? Why must we do it this way? And so I write about a way that I did it. I bring the Gestalt back. I'm safe a bit now. I have a clear credential, I have tenure, I have some financial security. I can afford to write about this and let the naysayers come after me.
Right. But Jamie, that's the absolute beauty of what you share, and that is you're not prescriptive. You're not saying, oh, with this type of child do this, with this type of child do this. You just share your wisdom. You share your experience as an educator. You share your experience as an autistic person who also happens to be a Gestalt processor, and you just drop these gems for people to walk away with and apply to their own life, whether it's their life as a parent, whether it's their life as a teacher or a speech language pathologist or occupational therapist, or their life in general. And I'm saying that to intentionally embarrass you, but what you share is just amazing on so many levels. And we try to keep our podcasts, and I say this with pain, within a certain time frame, but we would love to have you back and explore some other issues at some point, because there's so much more to share, and you just have an incredible talent in doing that. So,
thank you, and I'm always open to invitation with my time constraints and preparation problems and all of these kinds of things. And I thought, I'm just this, wee school teacher over here, kind of marooned in California, who wants to hear what I have to say. And I think, my lived experience is quite unique in certain aspects,
yes.
And then quite average and normal in others.
And everything, like Barry said, everything you share and everything I read, it leaves me just sitting there and thinking about it, like listening to your lived experience, which is what we talk about, especially in our previous episode, is listening to this lived experience and taking it in, and I sit on it and I think about it and I apply it when I'm working with families. Like, these are things that I'm sharing with families. I'm saying, listen to this lived experience. Like, the things that you're seeing, I believe you. And this is also someone who is a Gestalt processor, is autistic. Like, listen to their lived experience too. And even in your work, I have families that come to me and say, I feel so seen. Like, everything she's saying, I feel so seen.
Unfortunately, we'll have to bring this to a close. So on behalf of Jess, we are saying to a wee school teacher, thank you so much for sharing so much information. And we will be in touch, okay?
Indeed, it's my pleasure, and thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care. So to pull it all together, I would like to reflect on some of the 3 podcasts that you've just all listened to. And I would like, first of all, to thank our guests, Jess Teixeira and David Kaufer and Jamie Herricks. And I believe what it really comes down to when it comes to the issues of evidence-based practice and Gestalt language processing and non-speakers who use assisted communication, comes down to who do you believe and why, and what evidence do you use to say what is truly working. I'd like to begin with a quote from Jamie Herricks from the 3rd episode, and that is, quote, "You can't help anybody unless you know them." And I would say, you also cannot make pronouncements about what kind of supports they could benefit by or not benefit by unless you know them. So I do want to begin with the voices of some non-speakers who've been previously on this podcast and who I've gotten to know. Let's start with Danny Whitty. Danny said that his school years were awful and humiliating and traumatizing before he could communicate through spelling, and that he felt so lonely and misunderstood and saw no way for it to change. And he said that though my disability is inherently difficult, the way others have mistreated me made me feel far worse. Another young man who I knew, I asked him, "What is something that you're afraid of?" This was part of the conversation. And he said, "Nothing scares me more than people thinking I am not capable." And he spelled that out. Jordan Zimmerman, who was on our podcast, said, "It's difficult to explain the intense emotions of what it was like before I had effective communication. I was really unhappy. I was restrained on a daily basis for years. The teachers would set timers, get off of me when the law mandated it, and then resume restraining me. I repeatedly went home with bruises and other injuries, but was unable to share about the trauma that I was enduring." And of course, we know that Jordan has gone on for her master's degree and who consults now to a number of national organizations. Elizabeth Bonker, who was the valedictorian at her college in 2022, commented on what she thinks about the critics and what we have referred to as the naysayers. She said, "I call it unethical behavior for these ableists to personally attack me and other recent college graduates when they have never even met us." Danny Whitty said, "There is a lot of nonsense out in the autism treatment universe, so I understand some degree of skepticism. But that does not excuse the uninformed and toxic attempts to discredit the mode of communication that has saved the lives, at least emotionally and mentally, of so many like me." So what has happened since these individuals have learned to spell or type to communicate? A young man named Alex said, "To say my life was changed would be an understatement. My life was saved." Even small things like choosing my outfit every day to huge monumental topics like grief and future dreams and advocacy for non-speaking people are all open to me for the first time in my life. And that was shared by Danny Whitty. Jordan said, "Before I could communicate, people assumed I had an intellectual disability. Learning to type gave me a voice and the chance to show who I really am. Spelling gave me the chance to show my real intelligence. I surprised everybody when I started typing. You need to presume competence." Ian Nordling, another non-speaker who was on our podcast twice, said, "The very most loving thing you can do is hear my words and believe them." So, who are we to believe? Are we to believe these spellers and typers who in many cases have spent years gaining the motor control with a trusting partner or trusting partners to communicate? Or do we believe some of the naysayers, such as Catherine Beals, who with no clinical degree or certification, but lots of opinions, implied that non-speakers on this very podcast are not communicating their own thoughts without even meeting them or observing them, or that Dave, my co-host, and guests with clinical diagnoses could not be neurodivergent because their speech was too fluent? Or do we believe Dr. Howard Shane? And let me say I've known Howard for decades and have a lot of respect for the early work that he did, especially in high-tech AAC options, but also then led the authorship of the ASHA position statement, which has been used to prohibit the ability of non-speakers to use their preferred and most effective mode of communication in some settings. Let's talk about hypocrisy a little bit. One of his major arguments has been, well, there is no evidence to support the efficacy of these approaches. Well, Howard, you know that you have published a system based upon visual supports that you do trainings on and that there's a published book on. And in one of your writings just a couple of years ago, you stated there is not yet efficacy data on the use of this system as a package. Okay? Or let's talk about another colleague who's been critical of non-speakers in particular, Dr. Ralph Schlosser. He's criticized the absence of published research on spelling and typing methodologies, and therefore we shouldn't be using them. But in his own publication in 2009, he spoke about empty reviews or reviews of the literature that do not find any approaches as being effective. And he said empty reviews should not be the basis of prohibiting or discouraging the use of emerging practices. It just points to the need for more research. Let's talk about James Todd, a Skinnerian behavioral psychologist who, based upon a photograph that was posted online by the University of Virginia, simply of me greeting a few non-speaking autistic young men, he posted that I was exploiting the lives of autistic people and with no evidence at all of what was even going on during my visit. Okay? And when I threatened him with a defamation lawsuit and complained to his department chair and the university president, then magically that tweet just disappeared immediately. Well, I have screenshots of them to prove that it really happened. Clearly a defamatory comment. And then finally from Australia, Bronwyn Hemsley, who is a speech-language pathologist, primarily a researcher, who I think you could say is kind of a Johnny-come-lately to autism, because most of her work was in the area of swallowing disorders or dysphagia. And she also is making claims as if she has expertise about both non-speakers as well as Gestalt language processors. So let me kind of conclude by saying, as a group, the people who've been most critical and have impacted the lives of non-speakers and Gestalt language processors show virtually no understanding of the relationship between regulation and communication, nor an understanding of current, deep understanding of autistic people. So, my advice to them, I go back to Jamie Herricks, our third guest. You can't help anybody unless you know them. So it's time for you all to get to know the non-speakers, the Gestalt language processors, the parents, and the family members, rather than avoiding the communities. You take it from there.